Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day friends, and don't worry, I'll return to the life service and legacy of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor next episode, but this is a special one to mark International Nurses Day. International Nurses Day is celebrated around the world every May 12th, the anniversary of the birth of the mother of modern nursing, Florence Nightingale. And this year's theme of International Nurses Day is Our Nurses, Our Future. However, even if we look to that future, we cannot forget to look to the past. But before we start the episode, I wanted to share a review I received apparently from Beyond the Grave, as Harry Harvard Morant gave the podcast 5 stars with the review always interesting. Well, I'm glad he enjoyed it, but with that out of the way, let's get started. Florence Rebecca Casson was born on the 6th of March 1908 in Warrnambool, Victoria, to Henry and Mary Casson of Williston, South Australia. She was the second eldest of 3 surviving children and the eldest surviving daughter, as her older sister, Diana, passed away in 1902. Not much is known of her early life, save that she commenced her general nursing training at the Mannum Hospital in Pinaroo, South Australia in 1929, before transferring to complete her training at the Adelaide Hospital in South Australia on May 19, 1934, at the age of 26. There she returned to the Mannum Hospital and worked as a charge nurse. She then worked in various country hospitals including Jamestown and Port Pirie, before undergoing her midwifery certification at the newly opened Queen Victoria Maternity Hospital in Adelaide on the 8th of May 1940, before being appointed as matron of the Pinaroo Soldiers Memorial Hospital in July that year. Pinaroo is a small South Australian country town near the South Australian-Victorian border, and during her time there, she also joined the militia as a staff nurse on the 6th of July. She was working there when she presented to Kazakh Barracks in Wayville, South Australia, to enlist in the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force on the 10th of May 1941 and formally joined the Australian Army Nursing Service. She was initially called up and commenced duty at Camp Hospital of the Woodside Camp in South Australia. The Woodside Camp was originally a militia training camp for light horse and infantry units, but was handed over to the Australian Imperial Force for the training of the 2nd 10th, 2nd 43rd, and 2nd 48th Australian Infantry Battalions. On the 18th of June, her father Henry would sadly pass away at the age of 75. 2 months later, on the 31st of August 1941, she would be appointed to the newly raised 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital and board a train in Adelaide bound for Melbourne. On the 2nd of September, Sister Florence Casson left the recruit and training camp at Caulfield Racecourse and boarded the Australian hospital ship Wanganella bound for Malaya. As mentioned in earlier episodes, 1941 looked bleak in Europe and North Africa, and as a result, Britain had started to strip their overseas garrisons to help reinforce the home islands for the inevitable German invasion. This meant that the defence of these now undefended territories fell to the autonomous dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, and South Africa. In fact, Australia already had 2 divisions of the second raising of the Australian Imperial Force, the 6th and 7th Divisions, already in the desert. A 3rd Division, the 8th Division, had been raised at the same time as the 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital and would join them in Malaya. The 4th Division, the 9th, was in the process of being raised and would be sent to North Africa with the first 2 divisions. Casson would be assigned to the 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital as a sister, and the rest of the hospital's complement would disembark the Wanganella on the 15th of September in Singapore Harbour. When the unit arrived, the staff would rotate between the 2nd 13th and the already established 2nd 10th Australian General Hospital and 2nd 4th Casualty Clearing Station for training and acclimatisation. Both hospitals would operate around Singapore and Sumatra and primarily deal with large numbers of tropical-based afflictions. As Casson was appointed as a sister, she would stay with the 2nd 13th until November, where she was attached to the 2nd 4th Casualty Clearing Centre, unlike staff nurse Vivian Bullwinkle, who spent most of October and November with the 2nd 10th. Now, the nomenclature of staff nurse, sister, and matron are no longer officially used in Australian nursing, though considering how comparatively recently these terms have left the official lexicon, you will still hear nurses and refer to each other as sister and matron, often used on wards as a term of endearment and respect. Translated to modern terms, staff nurses are generally inexperienced junior nurses, Sisters, despite being the term most people associate with nurses in general, was actually only referred to nurses who were in charge of a shift, while matrons are nurses in charge of a ward. On the 22nd of November, 1941, Casson would return to the 2nd 13th AGH and would be there on the 7th of December, 1941, when the Japanese would commence their land invasion of the Malayan Peninsula. With a point of historical context, the Japanese launched their invasion of Malaya 10 hours before their attack on Pearl Harbor, and simultaneously with the attacks in Hong Kong, Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines. Now, while the defenders of Malaya would try and stall the Japanese advance long enough until the hoped-for reinforcements from either Great Britain or America arrived, spoilers, they weren't coming, the strategic downside of Britain's reliance on Dominion troops and the Allies' policy of prioritizing winning the war in Europe first disadvantaged the garrison on Malaya, particularly the Australian, British, and Indian troops, as they were largely inexperienced and overall poorly led and undersupplied and ill-equipped. Now, this isn't to discount the brave actions of the individual soldiers or units in the defense, but they were simply facing a much more experienced, motivated, and eager Japanese force. Even with the arrival of the Royal Navy battleships HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, while proving a massive boon to morale, could do nothing to halt the rapid and devastating Japanese advance, as they would be sunk on the 10th of December, just 2 days after arriving. Despite the immediate threat posed by the Japanese landing troops in Malaya, the 2nd 13th AGH still managed to host a Christmas concert for the men recovering there, including decorating the hospital for the season. And according to the official history of the 2nd 13th AGH, it wasn't actually until the 13th of January where it appears the first issuance of orders affecting the conduct of the Japanese invasion took place, with the hospital's tents being camouflaged. Most of the patients being seen by the nurses were still largely affected by malaria, more than battle casualties. The evening of the 16th would see the war officially reaching the 2nd 13th, with a sudden influx of wounded soldiers, which was met by the training and resolve of the medical personnel. While they effectively tended to the wounded, on the 21st of January, the hospital was ordered to relocate to the fortress of Singapore Island, which commenced on the 24th, and by 2300 hours, all remaining patients had been relocated to Singapore as the sounds of battle grew closer. On the 31st of January 1942, the causeway connecting Singapore with Malaya was destroyed, and there was now nowhere to go, so as a result, a large red cross was painted on the roof of the buildings commandeered for the hospital, which hopefully would dissuade the Japanese. However, it didn't seem to stop them, as the Japanese attacked the nearby airport and oil reserves, and despite the supposed protection as non-combatant status, the hospital was directly targeted at least once, and at least 5 personnel were killed. On the 6th of February, the order had been given that the nurses were to be evacuated. This order wasn't received well by the nurses, who chose service over self, wanted to continue tending to the wounded even if the soldiers under their care wanted them to get out while the going was good. However, by the 9th, over half of the nurses had been evacuated aboard the ocean liner Empire Star, and all 60 would end up reaching Australia. This left 65 Australian nurses who insisted on staying behind to tend to the wounded, which included Sister Casson. However, by the 12th, the inevitable was apparent. Singapore was going to fall, and the nurses reluctantly boarded the royal yacht of Sarawak, the SS Werner Brooke, along with more than 300 predominantly European civilians, government officials, and wounded soldiers. It is at this time that Sister Florence Casson's service record goes silent, as she'd be officially reported as missing on the 22nd of April, backdated to the 16th of February, as the surviving garrison surrendered to the Japanese. This is, however, not where her story ends. Regrettably, though, there is not much left to tell. On Valentine's Day, 1942, the Japanese aircraft would relocate the Werner Brooke and attack it with machine guns and bombs, sinking it and forcing the survivors overboard. 12 nurses would be killed in this attack, and most would make it to life rafts or cling to debris. Sister Casson was severely wounded by a blast, which damaged both her legs and possibly breaking one. She was treated by her fellow nurses before being helped into a raft. Others joined the 3 lifeboats, and those who could swim made for the nearby Bangka Island. In total, 22 nurses would wash ashore on Raji Beach on Bangka Island in the Dutch East Indies in what is now modern-day Indonesia. Some washed ashore elsewhere along the straits and were taken prisoner. However, most were either lost at sea or went down with the ship. They would be joined by a large number of survivors, namely wounded soldiers and civilians, over the following 2 days. And they would be joined by survivors of some of the other 40-odd Allied vessels sunk by the Japanese in the 2-day period along the same time the Werner Brooke was sunk. Eventually, this number of survivors would reach 100. With such a large group, they had to assess their options. With no adequate food, shelter, or medical equipment, they had determined their location had already fallen to the Japanese. It was decided that the survivors of the Verna Brook would surrender. Casson's raft reached the beach later that evening. Her wounds were serious and appeared to have caused severe nerve damage. It seems that she and a few other more seriously wounded were later in that day transferred to a nearby uninhabited fishing hut further down on the beach out of the elements. She spent another night on the beach being cared for by her companions with what little they had by way of medical supplies, while Sub-Lieutenant Jimmy Miller, Royal Naval Reserve, who was second officer and engineer on the Verna Brook, led a delegation to locate Japanese forces on the island to enact a surrender. While they waited, Irene Drummond, the matron of the 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital, urged the civilians in their company to make their way to the island's capital of Montauk, leaving the nurses to care for the wounded men. By mid-morning, Sub-Lieutenant Miller returned with a party of Japanese soldiers to officiate the surrender. When they arrived, they immediately segregated the officers from the other ranks, the nurses from the soldiers, and the walking wounded from those more critically injured. They then ordered the officers and NCOs to move down the beach towards the rocky headland, and once they were out of view, they were stopped, blindfolded, then bayoneted. They then rounded up the remaining walking male survivors and then led them towards the same beachhead, though now a soldier carrying a light machine gun joined them. As the Japanese soldiers returned, it became clear what had happened, as they sat down in front of the nurses and started to clean the blood from their weapons. Sister Lainey Balfour Ogilvie suggested that the nurses make a run for it, but this was overruled by Matron Drummond, reminding her they still had patients under their care and the belief that the nurses would be protected. Unfortunately, the women, 22 nurses and 1 civilian, were ordered into the sea as a machine gun was set up on the shore behind them. Casson, unable to walk, was supported by her fellow nurses, and they were marched out into the surf, shoulder to shoulder, Red Cross armbands worn like shields in the hope of protecting them for what was about to happen. Once they were in the surf, the Japanese opened fire, killing them all save for one nurse, Vivian Bullwinkle. Casson was on the rightmost side of the line with the other wounded nurses, and as a result was one of the first to be fired on. The last words she would have heard was from Matron Irene Drummond saying, quote, "Chin up girls, I'm proud and love you all," unquote. This was just before the shooting started. Sister Florence Rebecca Casson was executed by the Japanese at the age of 38, and as the requirement of the time stated that nurses had to be unmarried, she has no direct descendants, though she was survived by her sisters Alice and Lorna and her mother Mary, who would sadly pass away in 1946. Her brother Thomas also enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force and sadly would also become a prisoner of war of the Japanese, though he did survive the war and did come home. It would not be until the 4th of January 1945 when Florence Casson would officially be listed as killed in action. Like Vivian Bullwinkle, she had been promoted in absentia to the rank of Sister Group 1 in 1944. In September 1945, Matron-in-Chief of the Australian Army Nursing Service, Matron Annie Sage, stepped off a plane at the Lahat airfield in Indonesia where the survivors had been gathered, and in her possession was a simple luxury for her missing nurses. 65 individual lipsticks in victory red, one for each of the nurses of the Verna Brook. When only 24 nurses stood before her, in her dismay, her only words were simply, quote, "But where are the rest of you?" unquote. When the survivors were brought back to Singapore for treatment, the Australians manning the hospital, quote, "wept at the sight of them and demanded guns to go out to the Japanese concentration area," unquote. Sister Florence Rebecca Casson is commemorated on the Pinaroo Hospital where she was matron, as well as a display to her life in the Pinaroo Museum. She's also commemorated on the Royal Adelaide Hospital Chapel of Honour, the Adelaide's World War II Wall of Remembrance, the Augusta Australian Army Nursing Sisters Monument, the Australian Military Nurses Memorial, the Ballarat Australian Ex-Prisoners of War Memorial, the Bicton Verna Brook Tragedy Memorial, the Door Park Repatriation Hospital World War II Hospital of the Armed Forces Who Died Honour Roll, the Gawler Council World War II Honour Roll, the Kapunda Dutton Park Memorial Gardens Nurses Plaques, the Launceston Bangka Island Massacre Memorial, the Pinaroo War Memorial, the Singapore Memorial, and her name is listed on the Roll of Honour of the Australian War Memorial. She has also been commemorated as part of the Australian College of Nursing Foundation's Bullwinkle Project as a nursing scholarship made in honour of each of the 21 slain nurses. And there you have it, folks. That is the life, service, and legacy of Sister Florence Rebecca Casson. Works cited in this episode are the service record of Sister Florence Rebecca Casson, the prisoner of war inquiry record for Sister Florence Rebecca Casson, the history of the 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital, On Raji Beach by Ian W. Shaw, the website of the Australian War Memorial, the website of Trove, the Australian Digital Newspaper Archive, the website of the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital Museum, the State Records of South Australia, the Australian Nurses Memorial Centre, and the Australian College of Nursing. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job Australia's Military History Podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Gangdangara people whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This episode was written, researched, produced, directed, and audio engineered by me, Ross, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. If you do know someone whose story needs to be told, feel free to leave a comment on an episode or send us an email at iwasonlydoingmyjobpod@gmail.com. If you like what we do here and you want to support this podcast, the best thing you can do is share this with a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, as it really helps others find the show. And if you want to join in on the conversation, join us over on Discord. And if you want more content, including show notes, photos, transcripts, and my various adventures finding memorials dotted around Australia, head over to our website at www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on all our social media pages at IWODMJ. Don't worry, there are links to everything in the show notes. Join me personally for more bite-sized history over on TikTok and pretty much everywhere else at Doc Winters. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not reflect the views or opinions of any entity, agency, or organization. It is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time. Bye.